The 2017-18 Mid-Year Economic and Fiscal Outlook, MYFO, is another reminder, if one is needed, that the relationship between the budget and the economy runs in both directions. While we mostly ask the question, how will the budget affect the economy, this update shows the economy can also have, and has often had, a significant impact on the budget. The highlights of this year's MYFO, as far as the government is concerned, are the $9.3 billion improvement in the underlying cash balance over the 4 years to 2020 to 21, compared with what had been forecast in the May budget, and the consequential $11 billion reduction in the forecast peak in net debt, from a $366 billion to a $355 billion, in that year. These improvements are the result of revisions to economic assumptions and other so-called parameter variations since the budget, which in total have improved the 4-year bottom line by more than $11 billion. The biggest of these came from reductions in payments to people with disabilities, students, single parents and age pensioners, totaling a $4.6 billion over 4 years, due to lower than expected recipient numbers. Read more. Budget update shaves growth and wage forecasts but is brighter about the deficit. Personal income tax cuts seem possible. There is no additional detail in MYFO regarding the government's foreshadowed personal income tax cuts ahead of the next election. But if the forecast surplus flat or 2020 to 21 of a $10.2 billion is credible, then there's arguably some scope for the government to fund personal income tax cuts beginning in that year. Although the cost of more significant tax cuts would escalate substantially over the medium term, there is actually more scope for these cuts than generally realized, provided the government succeeds in keeping growth in spending under control. That's because the projected moderate surpluses, averaging about 0.5% of GDP out to 2027-28, incorporate an arbitrary assumption that taxation revenue will be capped at 23.9% of GDP. If that assumption wasn't made, the projected surpluses would rise to 1.6% of GDP by 2027-28. In dollar terms, that would imply a surplus of around $55 billion, compared with one of around $15 billion if the surplus were only 0.5% of GDP. Over the period 2021 to 22 to 2027-28, relaxing the assumption that tax revenues are capped at 23.9% of GDP results in almost a $90 billion of additional budget surpluses. This is over and above what is projected with the tax cap in place. Presumably, some of those additional surpluses are absorbed, in the government's internal figuring, by the promised phased reduction in the company tax rate for businesses turning over more than $50 million per annum by 2025 to 26, which according to the last publicly available estimate would reduce revenues by some $65 billion over 10 years. However, that would still leave a considerable amount left over to pay for personal income tax cuts, and allow the government to continue to project surpluses of around 0.5% of GDP out to the second half of the next decade. That's assuming, of course, that we are able to clock up 36 years of uninterrupted economic growth, and that all the other projections come to pass, including for a return to more normal rates of wages growth.